Okay, we're gonna bring up our next speaker. The next speaker is one of my very best friends. I'm so glad I get to introduce her. She's so pretty and smart. I love her so much. Elizabeth's bio is you've read it. It's a laundry list of accomplishments. It says, Elizabeth doesn't just participate in culture, she creates culture. And it's so, so true. I'm gonna read a couple of items. She doesn't just study culture, she creates it. She's worked with some of the largest brands that we know, E-Trade, Acura, JetBlue. She authored the Visibility Brief, which in her marketplace, in her fields, she just is doing incredible things. She is a thought leader. She's also a wife of one and a mother of four, including the dog. Yeah. And she just is an amazing, amazing person. She loves God. I remember the first time I met her, I was leading worship. She came into the church. I didn't know who the lady was, but that's fine. We have visitors at our church. And she sat in the front row. And I said, okay, who's this lady? Literally after worship was over, she came up to me and she said, hey, can I pray for you? Laid her hands on me, prophesied over me, and prayed for me. I said, who is this woman that I've literally never seen before? And she has been such a gift in my life, such an encouragement, and a sweet, sweet, sweet friend. And when asked whether she'd rather have the ability to fly or be invisible, she said she'd rather fly, because it's going to satisfy her wanderlust. And also, if you're invisible, you'd be tempted to eavesdrop on conversations and also potentially get your feelings hurt when people are talking bad about you, which I totally get, which is why we're friends. We're on the same page. Okay, welcome Elizabeth Paul.
Guys, I was so engrossed in Patricia's talk. And then 90% of the way through, I was like, man, I pity the person who has to go after, oh, that's me. That's rough. Thanks for having me. So my talk is called, Who Do You Think You Are? But I have to admit, when I first heard the name of the conference, InfluencHer, what should I be pointing this at? Am I pointing this at you? There you go. All I could think about is influencers in the wild. Does anybody follow them on Instagram? It's one of the best follows. These are meant to be gifts, so apologies that they're not. It's okay, you're gonna go on Influencers in the Wild, and it's gonna be the highlight of your day. Basically, when people are out in the wild doing crazy things for a selfie, they're wearing bikinis in a snowstorm, or they're showing up at a protest in a ball ground, and you see somebody acting the fool, you take a picture, you send it to this Instagram account, and then we all get to giggle at selfie culture. And I thought about that because I saw this piece of research that was comparing dream jobs 50 years ago and dream jobs today. So they were polling young adults, this was men and women. And in 1971, the 3 dream jobs were teacher, scientist, and doctor. Anybody want to guess what the 3 dream jobs are today? The number one response, a third of the respondents said YouTuber. Number 2 is blogger/vlogger. And number 3 was singer/actor. This list makes me sad, y'all. Which really is, I think they're all about celebrity, right? We are in a culture that worships celebrity, and that has gotten into the cultural waters, and it has impacted the way we think, the way we behave. And not just a few of us, really everyone, and the expectations. So in the US and the UK right now, kids are 3 times more likely to say that they want to be an influencer than an astronaut. In China, the number 1 answer is astronaut. So this says a lot about our culture. And so I don't know about you, but I look at that and I'm like, how on earth did we get here? What has happened? We could point to Andy Warhol's, prescient comment that in the future, everyone will get 15 minutes of fame. And so I thought a lot about that and the difference between fame and influence at an event called InfuencHer, when we think about the influence we've been given and the influence that we're asked to step into. And I think to the world, fame is about individual platform, and influence is about the power that that platform provides, right? The more people know you, the more people like you, the more people pay attention to you, the more audience you have, the more power you command. But it's interesting, there's nothing new under the sun. And I swear this is maybe a little bit out of context, but I kept thinking about the verse in Luke where the disciples are all talking about who's going to be the GOAT, right? They're all like, who's the greatest? Who's the best? Because we're all going to have action figures and like we're going to be the influences of our day. And Jesus is like, you are not to be like that, right? Like the world has power and authority and they lord it over people. But this is a different kingdom and you're not to be like that. Because in the kingdom, fame is reserved for Jesus alone. And influence is the delegated authority that he gives us as kids of the king. So the good news is you are absolutely created for influence. Please don't take a picture in a bikini in a snowstorm, because if you do, I will take a picture of someone taking that picture and I will send it to influencers in the wild. But you are absolutely created for influence. And then I often think about the fact that all of these conversations aren't conversations about influence, they're conversations about identity. Like that's the thing that is at the core. So instead of who do we think we are, I think the question all of us probably ask every day is how do we know who we are and where does that identity come from? This is a very long quote. I don't know if I'm going to read the whole thing, but I read this book in my early 20s by Donald Miller called Searching for God Knows What. It was like this really transformative book for me at the time. And it's fun because my job is effectively cultural anthropology. Like I study culture for a living, which is super fun. Like my job is to understand what's trending and what's going to be trending, what people are talking about and why they're talking about it, what it means, why people do what they do. And then I help businesses and organizations understand those. And so a lot of what I do is I study like human behavior and psychology. And so this is a book about faith, but he captures something that every field of social science studies, which is effectively that human beings understand themselves by comparing themselves to other people. Like that's how we know we're normal, that's how we know we're okay. Like think about, when your kids are babies, if you have kids and you take them to the pediatrician is like, here's how they're tracking compared to other babies that baby's age. Like that's how we understand people. And he said, humans as species are constantly comparing themselves in every way. The driving influence behind all of our social development, our emotional health, our sense of joy, our greatest tragedies is that comparison. It's as though something that helped human beings function well has gone missing, right? And so we are looking for it in all kinds of other places. The thing that told us who we are and what we're for has gotten disconnected from the source. And so we look for it in each other, we look for it at work, we look for it in the mirror, we look for it in our bank account, we look for it in our relationships. Who am I and am I okay? So today, the biggest tool for social comparison in the world is obviously social media. Every day it tells us if we're liked, if we're normal, if we're noticed, if we're successful, if we're seen. Even if people don't realize that's what they're going to social media for, by and large, that is one of the biggest impacts of social media, which is why people spend on average about an hour a day, like all those little micro check-ins, and the way the behavioral economists have gotten us to be pinged and stop what we're doing and go look at this instead. Even though we know, like the research is out, we know both anecdotally and scientifically that they are making us angrier and lonelier and more anxious and more afraid and more addicted, we do it anyway, right? Because we can't seem to help it. As I said earlier, there's nothing new under the sun, which makes me think about this temptation of identity is not new. Sometimes when sociologists are talking about all the things that are happening in technology, and they look at the history of human behavior, it's like, well, do we have maps for this, right? Because when certain studies were done, you didn't have smartphones, you didn't have DoorDash, you didn't have delivery, you didn't have all the things. But what's interesting is most behavioral scientists are we have new software for, multi-million-year-old hardware. The human brain has not changed. The way we think, the way we make decisions, the way we understand the world hasn't changed. We just have technological accoutrements all around it, right? So I look at the Bible, and I think this is a story in Matthew 4 where Jesus is tempted. Most of us remember the temptations themselves, right? Turn stones into bread, jump off the cliff, the angels will catch you, I'll give you the kingdom. The thing that's easy to miss is how all of his sentences begin. Satan starts by saying, if you are the Son of God, do this. If you are the Son of God, then do that. He's tempting him to try to earn his identity, right? And we get that same temptation every day. If you are worthy, if you are a daughter of the king, then blank, right? None of that is new. But the story right before that, the story right before the temptations is the story of Jesus' baptism. And I love the story because it happens before Jesus has done anything to like earn the hype that follows him through the rest of history, right? Like he hasn't performed his first miracle, he hasn't preached his first sermon, he hasn't gathered his first crowd, like none of that has happened yet. And he's baptized, and God says, and I'm totally a crier, by the way, Aaron knows this, I like can't read the Bible publicly without crying. It's a joke in our church. I don't get asked to read the Bible publicly anymore because I can never get through any of it. I don't know what it is. But God says, like, this is my son with whom I'm well pleased. He gives him his identity and his approval before he's done anything to earn it. Like, how amazing is that? The rest of us will spend the entire day, the entire week, trying to work for our identity and trying to get approval from all kinds of crazy places, including our work. And God gives it to Jesus before he's done anything. And that power that comes from his identity, that's what carries him into the desert. So this question of who do you think you are is the same question that we're asked every day. And we get to choose to do what Jesus did and understand who we are and whose we are, connect ourselves to our identity, and from there to go out and do our work, right? Or if we don't have that, if we're not connected to the source, then all of us, even if we have the Holy Spirit, even if we know the Lord, will go out and we will be tempted to find our identity everywhere and how well we did a task, and whether or not we got that promotion, and whether or not we're having a good hair day, and how well our kids did, and whether or not our neighbor gave us a side eye. Like there's all these different cues. And so we talked about this new software. Because this is a conference of stories, I wanted to think about 4 times that I was kind of reminded who I am. And I'll tell these quickly in interest of time. So these are not in chronological order. These happened in different times in my life. This is a story from the first time I got like my only like really bad performance review at work that I'd ever gotten. I don't know if anybody here is into the Enneagram, but like I'm a 3, like the achiever. So my temptation is to like work for gold stars and approval. I'm like, I will work for positive praise. And I was working so hard. I was like, killing it. I didn't think that I was finding my identity in my work until somebody gave me a bad review. And the review was something to the effect of like, too ambitious, pushing too hard, needed to get back in my lane a little bit. We can have a story offline about the fact that my mentor looked at that and was like, this is gender bias, but neither here nor there. It was the first time I'd ever like not been told I was doing well at work. And I went to the coffee shop, like right next to the office, like crushed. I mean, literally crushed. I think I went because I was like ashamed and embarrassed and all these other things. And I got like a Twitter notification, which is mainly just noteworthy because I'm like not on Twitter. I think I have 8 followers and I check it once a year. But for some reason I got a Twitter notification and it said Tim Keller had tweeted. And the tweet just said, sometimes when it feels like God is killing us, he's actually saving us. And it was just like this profound moment where God was like, this is rough, kid. Like, you need a bad review. Like, bias or not, there was just a time where God was like, you are safe and you are saved, because that's not who you are. A good review or a bad review, not who you are. This time actually came from this summer. So I hiked the Salcantay Trail to Machu Picchu with one of my friends in August. So it was 51 miles through the Andes and the Amazon. I'm not normally much of a hiker or a camper. This is what happens when a girlfriend's going through a hard time and you're like, I'll go on a trip with you. Where do you want to go? And you don't ask enough questions. She was like, let's go to Machu Picchu. And I was like, sure. Is there like a nice hotel there? Or a train? And there is a nice hotel and a train. But she was like, no, here's what we're going to do. I Googled women's adventure travel. And we're going to climb through the mountains and we're going to sleep in a tent. And it was amazing. But what started as a trip for me to do something for a friend, I was like, I actually need better motivation than that if I'm going to get through this very hard thing. And so, as I prayed about it and processed it, East End Fellowship, we have house churches that are part of the church that gather to worship on Sundays. And so somebody in my house church is like a big hiker. And I was asking her, because she's done all these, I guess it's called a 14er, where you do 14,000 feet. I've never done anything like this. I don't know the words. I don't have the gear. I just foolishly signed up for a trip. Anyway, she was like, well, you really need to understand your why. Like, you really need to think about, like, why you're doing it, and you should pray about that. Like, you should ask God, like, besides going to be a good friend, you're going to do that anyway. That got you on the plane. What is the why that God is giving you? And I thought about it, and I processed it, and I was like, coming out of COVID, like, I experienced a lot of anxiety for the first time in my life in 2020. I've never been, like, a particularly anxious person. I have other flaws, don't get me wrong, but anxiety is not one that's really been a struggle, but, like, I found 2020 paralyzing. And I was coming out of that year, like, feeling really afraid. And I started to pray about it, and I got the sense that God was like, you might be stronger than you think you are, because I don't think of myself as very strong, and I don't think of myself as very brave. And so those became the two things. Like, maybe I'm stronger than I think I am, and maybe I'm braver than I think I am. And so going through the mountain, it was amazing. We made it. I'm here. It was not easy. I threw up 20 times the first day. It was not an easy road. I had altitude sickness. But as we went through the mountains, I could, like, hear God's encouragement. Like, I meditated on scripture. I sang psalms in my head. And God just over and over again was like, you can do this. I've made you strong. Third one. Oh, we're going to go back. This one will be fast. This was from a time in my life. I took 4 years off of work when my babies were babies. I had 3 kids in 4.5 years. And the first 2 were Irish twins, and I just needed to, like, buy a hat and hold on to it. And so I left that job where I'd kind of inadvertently gotten a lot of my identity. I loved what you said about how, like, you don't realize you're doing it. You're, like, 1 degree off. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, this job is a big part of how I understand myself in the world. So I decided to take a few years off and be home with kids, which is by far harder than that job or this job or any other job I've ever had. And I realized actually my identity was not so much coming from the title or the place. It was coming from feeling like I was good at things. Like, I was always getting positive feedback that I was good at things. I don't know about you guys, but, like, when you are home with kids, you very rarely feel like you are good at things. Maybe even when you're not home with kids, like, just kids have this lovely, sweet way of reminding you on a daily basis that you are not where you want to be yet. And so for 4 years, I went through this process where, like, God stripped all of these things out of my identity, like my job. We moved, so it was like a lot of my friends, my sense of place, like a lot of the material comforts, because I don't know if you know this, but when you're a stay-at-home mom and your husband's a pastor, like, things are tight. All these things that I would have been tempted to find my identity in were just gone. And one day, and I had little kids, so it's, like, kind of thankless, and I felt like a human Kleenex. I was like, I exist for people to wipe things on me, basically. And one day, we were living in South Florida. I just had this really low moment, and I was like, God, I don't know who I am. Like, I am nothing. And God was like, you're mine. And I don't know, God, I'm the actual worst about this. I don't know that I could have understood that or heard that at any other time. Like, if it weren't for all of those other things being taken away, I don't know that I could have received that, like, on such a fundamental level. And then the fourth time, and I told this story when Jordan and I met, I was reading one day the story about Peter and the disciples of the gates called Beautiful. Silver and gold I do not have. I think there's a children's song and probably a dance. I won't do it right now. But they performed the miracle, and there's this little line that I'd read the story 1,000 times and I'd never heard before. Like, I love when God does that. Like, you're reading the story that you've read 1,000 times, and there's, like, this little thing that the Holy Spirit just uses to, like, grab your heart and be like, this is the thing, And the line says something like, the people watching, when they realized that they were ordinary, unexceptional men, they knew that they had been with Jesus. And I was like, man, I've spent so much of my life trying to be not ordinary and, like, trying to be exceptional. And then I started thinking about all the characters in the Bible and how rarely God is able to work with extraordinary people. Like, most of the people he picks and he pulls are people that there's, like, nothing special about them but him. And that works really well. The people who come in with, like, talent or ability or fame or whatever, think about Joseph, think about Paul, like, there has to be a deep breaking before God can even use them. And so this idea of, like you're exceptional because you're mine, but not for any of the reasons you're trying to be, right? Like, was another way that, like, God spoke to my identity. And so these are all, you were safe, you were mine. I think the reason I have so many of these is, at least for me, I'll speak for myself, I don't know if this is true for you, it has not been enough for God to tell me who I am one time. Like, I need God to tell me who I am every day. And I need him to speak words of life into me every day so that I can have influence in the places and spaces in which God has called me and not lose the plot, not forget why I'm there, not forget what I'm being asked to be done. Because I think, and this is what Donald Miller talked about, until we're secure in our identity, we will look for affirmation in all the wrong places, right? I thought a lot about, do you guys know the story, Are You My Mother? You know, like the Dr. Seuss story, and it's like, it goes to the cow, are you my mother? It goes to the cat, are you my mother? It goes to the dump truck, are you my mother? Like, we are all that little bird, right? Like, we're going to our feed. Like, do you think I'm okay? We're going to our bank account. Do you think I'm okay? We're going to our body. Do you think I'm okay? Until someone that is designed to tell us who we are and whose we are and that we are okay, we are going to be just like this little bird, looking in all the wrong places. So I think the other question is, like, how do we exercise influence without the fame game, right? We talked about it earlier, like, fame is for Jesus, but we were created for influence. Like, how do you do that? And one thing I think, talking to a group of women here, that I think is very important to point out, is that healthy influence does not mean rejecting equity. Like, it does not mean that we should not be treated fairly in the places and spaces in which we work, or that we should be settling for less than our identity and the things we're called to do. You'll have to, like, excuse the language on the side. This is my favorite sign from the Women's March in 2016. This woman is, like, dressed like a suffragette. She's in her 80s, and she's like, I cannot believe I still have to protest this stuff. Like, cannot believe we are still here. So if you guys are familiar with the wage gap has persisted in our country more or less since the beginning of women actually getting paid to work. I believe today where it stands is that women on average make 77 cents to every man's dollar. By the way, this is much worse for women of color. 56 cents on the dollar, 63 cents on the dollar. And what makes me crazy is the research that says that at the current rate, this will not change for 114 years. And you're like, what? My granddaughter is going to be dressed like a suffragette at some march, being like, I can't believe I still have to protest this stuff. And it's really important to say this isn't everywhere. Like, we have wage equity at our company, and by the way, like, we secured wage equity in 1 month. We got our first female CEO. We have a predominantly female EC, our executive committee. And we, like, went to HR, and we have outside auditors come in every quarter and look at all of our books and make sure that everybody has wage equity. And if anybody's off for any reason, we're, like, constantly bumping people up to make sure it's fair. It does not have to last for 114 years, is my point. But as someone who has studied the ways that women in particular are discriminated against in the marketplace and what causes this to persist, again, this is a whole other conversation. There's a lot of reasons, right? There's the mommy tax. There's the negotiation penalty. Like, one of the arguments sociologists will talk about, or people in the marketplace will talk about, is they'll be like, well, women don't negotiate, right? What sometimes gets missed is that women are penalized for negotiating. And so all of these, like, it's not one thing. Like, wouldn't it be lovely if it was just one thing that we could fix? But alas, you have, the confidence gap, you have evaluation bias. This one in the confidence gap, I read a piece of research that actually changed the way I engaged at work. They found that men will raise their hand for an opportunity when they feel 60% qualified. Women will not raise their hand for an opportunity until they feel 100% qualified. Which is why often men are promoted on potential and women are promoted on past track record. You have to do the job to prove that you can do the job before you feel confident enough to raise your hand and say you can do the job. And even then, they might make you do it for another 6 months before they give you the title. That was my experience. Versus, men are like, I think I could do that. And probably some other dude is like, I think he could do that. And then he gets a promotion. And I read that at a point in my career where there was like I'd never raised my hand for a promotion or an opportunity before. I was like, put your head down, do the work, do the things. And then there was a role that opened up and I read this piece of research and I was like, I think I could do that job. And I almost didn't raise my hand for it, but I was like, right now there's some less qualified dude raising his hand being like, I think I could do that job. And so I think it's important to talk about these things because I think on one hand, influence can be this like siren song, right? Of like, I want to be heard. I want to be seen. I want to have clout. I want people to know me. And I think the Lord has things to say about that, right? Not just to call out people who go after that, but actually for our own hearts. And again, I'm a research nerd. This is what I do for work, so I have crazy studies on file in my head. But after Me Too, a lot of social scientists wanted to understand what power does to people's brains. Because they were like, how could this have happened? Like, how could you have this like moral failure in so many different places? It's like systemic abuse. And so they started studying, I'm going to quote a study from UCLA, but they started studying what power does to people's brains. And they found that over time, people who have power become more isolated, more insulated. They're less able to feel empathy. They are less able to imagine somebody else's perspective. And I could get into like what's happening in your frontal cortex and so on and so forth. These were just observations. Like, these are scientists, UCLA Med School. They're less able to mirror other people's behavior. So I go back to Jesus being like, you are not to be like that. He's not just doing that because he doesn't want us to be jerks in the world doing bad things, but like your kids running around behaving really badly and making the family look bad. Like, he also doesn't want that for us because he loves us, and it's not good for us. It's not good for our hearts. It's not good for our relationships. It's not good for our lives. So it's like we have that on one side, right? But then on the other side, we have women who have like historically been told to like put your head down, do the work, be quiet, fly under the radar, etc. And I actually think we have to wrestle with both of those things because we were made for influence. Like, you can look throughout the Bible, you can see Deborah and Junia and Priscilla and Mary and Esther and Ruth and all of these women who were given influence and who the Lord used. And I fully believe that every woman in this room has been given influence. You were saved from something, you were saved for something. There is work that before the creation of the world, the Lord has set out for you to do, right? The question is, how do we walk in that in a way that is like safe for our hearts and honoring of our God? So I always want to mention this because I think somewhere between like hiding our light under a bushel and putting our light on a lampstand and thinking we are the light of the world, like there's got to be a middle, right? Like, there's got to be something that's healthy for all of us, which, by the way, is no shade for either of these women. I actually love Kim K and Beyonce. I don't know what that says about me. But I think that's the thing that each of us has to wrestle with. Yeah, so this is her hiding in the bushes, and this is her being the queen. But I do go back to like Esther, like perhaps we were made for such a time as this. Perhaps the place that God has put you is exactly where he wants you, is the work that he has laid out for you to do. And I think for all of you, God wants you to know who you are so that you can step into that influence and you can carry it well. Because from that place, these are my daughters with whom I'm well pleased. He's got work for you to do. So get to work. Thanks.